could write front end and back end without having to switch to JavaScript. So when told at the job I had got at that time that I was going to develop front end and back end, I was like, oh, this is interesting. All I needed to do was to understand the Python programming language, which is no problem for me, and then get to work on the project. So let's get to Reflex. Reflex is a framework, just like we have the Django's of the world, the Flasks of the world, and on the front end, we can have things like React or React Native, or let's say Vue.js and Angular. Reflex is an app for, it's a framework for building web applications using Python. So to introduce Reflex, let's just look at how we can easily set up Reflex. So to install Reflex on your machine, all you're going to do is to do something like pip install Reflex. So this is going to collect everything that you need to develop, both the front end and the back end. After installing Reflex, you will initialize your project. So Reflex has a CLI. If you've done, let's say, development with Django, you know how it comes with the Django admin CLI that allows you to perform multiple actions. That's the same thing that Reflex also offers. So Reflex init kind of sets you up for developing, and it creates a folder structure that will be used for developing both the front end and the back end. So after setting up your project structure, you will have something like a setup or some boilerplate code you can start with, but it becomes more complex depending on what project you're actually working on. So this simple project structure right here points us to the different folders and the different files that we can start with. So I basically talked about, in this example, what the different components of the folder structure are. And just like you can see right here, we have assets. So basically your static assets like CSS, images, JavaScript can be put all in that folder. Then for this case, the Reflex PyCon talk was the main project folder where all the code for the project is going to be located. And then requirements.txt, we all understand how that works. It's where we keep all our requirements. Then rxconfig.py is a special file that allows us to set up our project configurations as keys and values. So all we have to do is to set up some sort of like rx.config object. So normally, for you to have access to everything that Reflex offers, you'll have to import Reflex and then put it in some sort of variable, such as I did, like import Reflex as rx, then I can get access to everything that Reflex offers. For my case, I get access to the config class, and inside that config class, I then have to start providing config values. And in our case, the first one was the app name, which is the Reflex PyCon talk. So this app name is the name that the application you're building has to have. So it's the name of the folder that has your Reflex code. Now, these are some of the configuration values, such as the app name, the API URL, how you structure your database, so you can provide the URI to your Postgres or SQLite or any other database you'll be using. You can also configure things like CORS. So CORS allowed origins, allows you to set that up easily. So I'm going to be walking through these slides a bit fast because I only have 30 minutes. And this is going to be steps you can take to develop a very simple 15, right? Okay, no problem. So the main entry point to any Reflex application is going to be the main file of the entire project. So this is where you're going to put your application instance. So frameworks like Django, frameworks like Flask and FastAPI always provide you an app instance on which you kind of plug everything and put the application together. So that's the same thing for Reflex. After creating your app instance, you can create a simple page or what is a component. So a component, if you've used frameworks like, let's say, React.js, a component allows you to define a structure of your UI that you want to render on your web application. So by defining a function, let's say index, you are creating a component and then you are trying to return a certain other component. So Reflex has all these components built in and they can allow you to render pretty much everything you can render with your HTML. So for our case, we are just rendering a container, and that is going to have a heading that will have the hello world message. And then all we have to do is to go ahead and Reflex run. So when you run our app, we expect that this is going to return hello world. But then we also have to add this as a page. I think I forgot to add that here, but I'm going to be showing you how to do that. So after rendering your hello world, you're good to go. You can start now experimenting and doing various things with the framework. So for our case, I talk about components. So components, just like I defined, they are just different ways to structure your code and reuse it in various parts of your UI. So in our case, we created a post component. So this was a very simple blogging app. You can get to contact me and I'll show you how it works at maybe the talk. So what it takes in a set of props, just like you do for React, but this is all written using Python. That's the beautiful thing. You don't have to actually understand how React works for you to work with Reflex. All you have to know is when you define a function and you provide parameters to that, you can then define the UI you want to return and then reuse that component with various arguments for that specific component. So for example, that's going to be the title, and then you also have the content of that specific post. So I created some dummy data, and this is basically a list of dictionaries for the specific content that we're going to populate our components with. Now, this is basically a function, but what this function does is to take in a list of data, and then it's going to iterate over that list of data and display our post component for all the items that exist within our list of data. So this is basically what it does. You define the function, which is the main component, and then that is what is going to render the box. That box is going to have all these items, just like you see in this example. So this is what the UI will look like. It will render all the post component instances, but all these will be populated or hydrated with the state or the data of the posts from our simple dummy data database. Now we also have style props. So if you're to think about props in React, I don't want to actually talk about React, but props are basically properties of a certain function. For our case, they are sort of like arguments to a component in this case. Now we have ways of providing styles to components, and these are normal CSS properties. So for example, you have this heading and it has a size of 4. So when you change the size, let's say to 5, you expect the heading to change in styling. So that's how you provide the style props for a certain component. And then you can see I also have margin. So margin allows me to adjust the margin of a certain component. And you can provide things like padding, background color, and so on, all on a component. Just like you call a function and then you provide your arguments. Now, this is more about styling. Styles can also be provided as dictionaries. So you can just use the style attribute or the style prop to simply provide a dictionary that has keys and values for whatever styles that you are going to use. So for this example, we have color, and then we specify the color, and then we have a margin. Then you provide the margin of that specific component, which is our box in this case. Now, we can also separate constants by creating Python modules that can have these styles. So you can create a file, let's say styles.py, and then have all your styles inside that file so that you can import styles and then get to refer to every dictionary using that styles file. So this is basically the components rendered with some styling, and all this styling is coming from the styles file right here. Now, this is basically the way we access the styles. So import styles. This is getting the styles from the styles dictionary or the styles module. And then from that styles module, we are going to style every component by using the special style parameter and then accessing those styles from our styles file. So pages, just like I explained, are the different parts of the application that you navigate to. And the way you create a page is by using the rx.page decorator. So you can create a function that returns some UI, but for you to make it a page, you can just simply decorate it with rx.page, and you have to specify which route or which part of your app that is going to be accessed. So in this case, I'm just accessing the post ID route. So this is how you provide, let's say, path parameters to your routes. So this will return the post detail, and then this will be the post detail. Now, navigating to other pages is going to be similar to what you do in a normal HTML. So you create a link. So for our case, that is going to be created rx.link, and then you have to provide just the same things you do in a normal anchor tag, like providing the href, and then you can also provide some styles. So that will allow you to have components that can help you to navigate to other parts of the application. So what I do here is to provide the title of, let's say, a specific post, so that when someone navigates to that component and clicks that link, they'll be able to navigate to the page that has the details of that specific post. So this is just the detail page that I've created. It doesn't have any dynamic data yet, but just demonstrates that you can navigate to another page. Now, let me talk about state. So state is data, and that basically that data is how you can have some persistent on the front end that is short-lived as long as your application is running. If you use web apps, you'll understand the fact that these web apps have the ability to keep, let's say, your session when you're logged in, and some other information that you may want to access in different parts of your application, and then depending on what actions you're carrying out, you'll be able to change that state. So Reflex allows you to create that state as classes, and then each of the attributes you define are going to be called vars or variables, but those variables are what are going to carry the state of your application. So for our case, you created the post state class. That post state class is going to have a post as a dictionary, so type hints are very important when you're creating state. You always have to define the type of that specific state variable you are creating. And also have a method right here that's going to update the state of a specific post. So that's the state current method, state current post method that I have here, takes in a post and then sets the current post or the state of the post to that post. So it's going to take in a dictionary of a post and then update that to be the current post. Now we also have computed variables or computed vars. So these computed vars are basically dependent on others. There may be scenarios where you have state that is going to change based on the, let's say, the value of another state variable. And in this case, you can create what is called a computed variable. And what it does is to basically take in the state, the current state of a certain state variable, and then update it given what you want to do. So my requirement here was to create a post slug for each of the posts that are provided. But the way to do that was to get the post state and then kind of compute it in a way that we shall have a post slug from the post title. So modifying the navigation, this is going to be dependent on the computed variable we had. So when you navigate to another page, we are going to be making use of the current post slug. Now, I know front-end is not my thing. I'm a back-end engineer. So I'm going to talk about the interesting things about Reflex. And this is where the back-end comes in. So database models are the way you define tables in your database through classes. So if you've used, how many of you guys have used FastAPI? How many of you guys have used SQL Model? So SQL Model is an ORM that allows you to use Pydantic with SQL Alchemy. So when you use SQL Model, you define your classes as Pydantic models, but then you can also add some functionality onto them to act as SQL Alchemy models. You can pretty much do everything you can do on an SQL Alchemy model on an SQL Model table. So Reflex allows us to wrap onto SQL Model to create tables in this fashion. You have rx.table, that is the class that every model is going to be inheriting from. And by specifying table is equal to true, you're using SQL Model's way to basically say that this is going to be a class that's also going to be a table in your database. So for this case, we just create the data structure of the title and the content for the posts, just like we did for our dummy data list. And then, how many of you guys have used Alembic? Okay, how many of you have used, let's say, the Django ORM? So basically, Reflex builds on top of Alembic, which is a data migration library, a database migration library for SQL Alchemy that allows you to keep track of your changes on your models and then translate those changes into database tables that you can then use. So for creating your migration environment, you're always going to run db init or reflex db init, and that will create the migration environment. And then each time you create, let's say, a change on your database model, or let's say you create a new database model, it's important that you import it in the main application module. And when you import it, you are going to create the migration or the revision for that. It's simply how you can do it for Django with, let's say, Python mani.py make migrations. So this is how you do it with Reflex DB make migrations, and then you provide a message that describes that specific migration. After doing that, you run reflex migrate, and your database will be set up. One important thing is you're going to always have a different folder structure. So this is basically the folder structure I had for the project, but you can see how you can pretty much go about editing your files. So if you're to look at this current folder structure, there is nowhere you are doing any sort of JavaScript. All that JavaScript is going to be compiled by Reflex in the backend. So whenever you write your Python, Reflex is going to take it on itself to compile that Python into Next.js code that will then be rendered on the browser. So that's why I said JavaScript is the best way to build for the browser. But then since we have Reflex, we can build with Python and then have web apps without having to deal with JavaScript. So this is our database model that has been written to the database. I was using SQLite, and this is basically the ID, the table, the title, the content, the created at, date, and so on. So basically, when you apply your revisions or your migrations, you'll have something like this. So if you're setting up a custom database and you don't want to use SQLite, you just add the DB URL variable to your configuration, and then that will set it up. Then another thing you can do with Reflex is to create API endpoints, and all those are going to be accessed from your main application instance via the app.api object. So this is a normal FastAPI instance. You can pretty much do anything you can do on the FastAPI instance. You can do things like creating routes, adding middleware. Let's say you want to create exception handlers. All that can be done on that API object. So this is a simple example of how you can create an API endpoint. You define a handler. So basically what happens is you have a route that helps you to create a request to a certain endpoint, and then you get a response. For this case, I have a function called index route that returns a message, I am an API endpoint. And after doing that, then you come to your application instance, which is here, and then you're going to just include the API route by using the add API route method. So you provide the path, which is going to be the index route, and then the endpoint, which is going to be the function to return the response. In that case, it's going to be our index route. Then you can also use FastAPI routers, like the way I did here. So we created a post router. That post router is going to have a prefix so that all the endpoints that are related to posts are going to be accessed via the posts prefix. Then after that, let's say we have our service class that's going to take care of the CRUD. We can just call a method to get all the posts, and that will return the posts just like you see right here. So you can do the normal FastAPI response model where you create the structure in which you want your response to be returned, and all that can be done on the Reflex instance. So you don't have to install, let's say, FastAPI. By default, when you install Reflex, you've installed FastAPI, you've installed SQL Model, and pretty much any other thing you may need to work with FastAPI. So database sessions, if you've worked with, let's say, SQL Alchemy, it's the way through which you make requests to your database. So in this case, this is the post service class that's allowing me to do the CRUD. And for my case, what I need is the session object. So the session object is what is going to allow me to write any query to the database and then be able to maybe do anything CRUD. For example, in this case, what I'm doing is to read. But I'll formulate this in a way that I'll use SQL model queries, and then by doing this, I'm just simply selecting posts, and ordering them by the created at date. In this case, I'm using the descending order. Then using the session, I can access methods such as all or filter or fast and so on. If you've worked with SQL Alchemy, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. All right, so this is how you add the routers. This is basically fast API. You use the include router method, you get a router object, and then you add it to the app instance or the API instance in this case, which allows us to access all those API endpoints on our app. So you can do everything that you can do on a fast API instance on that API instance. So in this case, I just defined how you create an exception handler for a 500 error message on your backend. So how to consume API routes? Reflex comes with HTTPX installed. So you can use HTTPX to create requests, and then you can access different API endpoints that may be in your app or may be outside your app. So for this case, we created the client object, and then that client object is making a GET request to our backend on localhost 8000/posts, and timeout equals none. That means we do not want the request to time out when it's being made. And then we return the response, and then that's what we can use to maybe set the value of our state for our posts. So this is the same thing, and then we can update our post content. Basically, since we've got the data from our API, we can get that data, populate our state, and then simply use that data in our state. So running actions on page load, if you've worked with the front-end framework, there are actions you're going to always perform when you render a page, such as loading data from an API. You just have to add the page and then provide the onload argument, and then that will provide your method for loading the posts. And so much more. So basically, there's so much to talk about Reflex. Yeah. There's so much to talk about Reflex. I could not do it all in 30 minutes. But if you want to check out more about Reflex, you can visit the Reflex documentation at reflex.dev. And also, one thing that I was about to talk about was deployment. So Reflex has its own internal self-hosting service that you can pay for and get your application deployed. So this is built to accommodate Reflex as a framework. But then you can also choose the approach of separating your front end and your back end, and then you pretty much build your front end and host that JavaScript, let's say on those platforms like, let's say, Netlify. So any questions that you may have are welcome. I'll start with you, Edmond.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
My question is in general about APIs. I have maybe I would say I'll call it a lead.
Yes.
If, most of the times people are talking about APIs, it's mostly web-based sort of services or serving.
Yes.
What library, in case I wanted to build an API that is sort of system-based, has no external communication, can't be accessed from the web, but in a sense, within a system, and what I'm looking for is sort of more availability, much more availability, much like webhook kind of availability.
Yes.
Which is not based on where the API is not sort of activated at the core, but full-time active, but communications don't have that. I don't want to call it lag, but that load process.
Okay, so
Yeah, something like a webhook, but
okay, so to answer your question, I think there are very many ways to develop APIs. So for the case of Reflex, I was referring to REST APIs. But then since it works with Fast API, you can also use things like WebSockets. You can set up things like GraphQL, and then you can pretty much develop your API. It's not like one approach to developing APIs only. You can use other approaches as well, depending on your need, right? Another question? Okay, yeah, thank you guys for, I would always say thank you guys for watching, but thank you for being available for my talk. If you want to access anything about me, scan that QR code. It can give you everything about me. You can scan it to take you to my channel. It will take you to the repositories for this code and everything you'll need. Thank you guys for watching.